This conference will now be recorded.
Yep.
Carla Berman. Juanita Bernal-Leon.
Good morning, I'm here remotely.
Here. Viviana Dixon. Here. Alicia Bird.
Here remotely.
Very good, thank you. Thanks for going to your side and said like you don't know. And people. First item on the agenda is some new changes.
We have two changes for agenda item 7. There's updated action and recommendation at your places for the CCD contractor. They will supersede what was in the packet, and I'm recommending that we move agenda item 11 after it's done to allow for further discussion of those numbers that needed that come to you.
All right, those are the changes. Is there a motion to approve the changes?
So,
Thank you. Motion and a second. Any objections? Motion carries. Item 2 is approval of the minutes from the November 12th, 2021 National Board meeting. Anyone at all? Is there a motion to approve? Motion and a second. Any objections? Motion carries. Item 3, general citizen comments. Do we have any citizens in the room or online that wish to speak before the board? Hearing and seeing none, we'll move on to item 4, acceptance of the annual program-wide audit report.
just for everyone's knowledge, we can come report from those people participating virtually that the audio is recorded. So if you can speak into the microphone as best as you can, we appreciate it. Moving on to that agenda item, we have Lauren Stroke from Charity Becker, who's been presented to you. Lauren, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me? Good morning. Can you hear me?
Lauren, we're not hearing you.
I can hear you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine from online.
Same here.
Let's see.
Lauren, we can hear you now.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Well, good morning. Do you have a copy of my presentation?
Yes, we do. You need just a second. Is it not on?
Not a problem at all. Thank you so much for pulling that up.
All right, there you go.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for allowing me to present to the management board today. My name is Lauren Strope, and I'm a director in the GSG or Governmental Services Group at Cherry Becker here in the Tampa office, and I had the pleasure of signing the audit report this year. So we have issued our report, and it is dated February 2nd of 2022. This presentation is my responsibility as the auditor to you, those charged with management or the management board or the board of the organization. And this presentation is really to go over the nature, the extent, and the timing of the audit procedures related to the audit. So at any time, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to interrupt me. All right, if we can flip to the next slide. To complete the audit of the estuary program, we actually follow 3 different types of standards, which results in 3 different types of opinions being issued. The first is the report just of the independent auditor on financial statements. This year we issued an unmodified opinion, which is the highest level of assurance that we as the auditor can give you. This is the opinion that is just over the financial statements and essentially says that your financial statements are free from any sort of material misstatement or error or lapse in disclosure. We also completed this audit under government auditing standards, or the Yellow Book standards, and issued that report, and that's on page 30 of the financial statements that you have. There was one comment in the Yellow Book report, and we'll get to that when we talk about the internal controls. As it relates to the single audit report, we did complete a single audit, which is an audit of your federal expenditures, as you exceeded the $750,000 threshold again this year. That was a no comment report, which is the highest level of assurance and a clean opinion. It's really what you want on that kind of report. And it essentially says that during our audit, we did not find any issues in compliance or any lapses of an internal control over that compliance. So again, that was a clean report. There are two other deliverables that are required by the state of Florida. The first is a management letter, and that's required by Chapter 10.660 Rules of the Auditor General of the state of Florida. And for that one, we have a clean letter or no changes to that letter. And so typically in that letter, it has us rep to a variety of different things. And if there are changes to that letter, it generally means there's a problem, but we did not have any. Additionally, the state of Florida requires us to issue an examination over compliance with investment policies, and that was a clean examination report as well, meaning that we did not find any lapses in investment policies, and we found that the policy did exist. On internal controls, we did note one material weakness, and that is disclosed on page 37 of the financial statements that you have. The material weakness related to revenue that was improperly recognized. So there was, I believe it was around $56,000 of revenue that was recorded and unfortunately was not adjusted with the final adjustment before the trial balance was sent to the auditor. So that was a material weakness in internal control. I am also required to communicate to you any sort of audit adjustments or past audit adjustments that we have. What an audit adjustment is when we as the auditor identify an adjustment that needs to be made in order to bring the financial statements in line with generally accepted accounting principles. A past adjusting entry is that exact same thing, except for management, for whatever reason, says, you know what, we want to pass on that entry or we don't want to make it. At that point in time, it would just be my responsibility to communicate that to you. We had one adjusting entry, and that was related to that $56,000 worth of revenue that was improperly recognized. We did not have any past adjusting entries, so very clean overall. Next slide. On this, I just wanted to touch base on some of the significant cycles that we look at. It's not to say that's the only thing that we do during the audit, but significantly we look at that financial close and reporting, and that's where you see a lot of the accrual types of items and pension adjustments, for instance. We look at the processing of cash receipts, cash disbursements, and of payroll. This year, as I mentioned, you did have a federal single audit performed, and that was over the National Estuary Program, and again, that was a clean report. We are required to test journal entries and significant transactions that happen throughout the year, and we actually use a data analysis tool in order to do that. We get the entire GL detail, and we are able to do analytics and look for riskier types transactions for testing. Nothing came about as a result of that testing, but it is something that we do perform. We also look at the IT controls that exist at the entity as it relates to the controls over the financial reporting system, backup and recovery, access and security, those types of things. Nothing rose to the attention, nothing rose to the level that we would need to bring to your attention as far as any issues within the system. And if we can slip to the final slide. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is the significant audit areas. On this again, this isn't to say this is all we do, but where we spend a significant amount of time on the assets and revenue side of things, obviously with cash investments and then the revenue and receivables. On liabilities and expenditures, we look at payrolls, expenses/expenditures, payroll, and we spend time on that pension adjustment. Other types of things that we look at are definitely fund balance, capital assets, prepaid expenses. We are required to look at any sort of related party transactions. We are required to look at minutes, have discussions with management up until the point of issuance to determine if there are any subsequent events that need to be reported. There were none. We look at commitments any sort of estimates and any sort of legal issues to determine whether or not they need to be disclosed or a liability needs to be recorded in the financial statements. So that's a little snippet of what happened during the course of the audit. Next slide. So in summary, clean opinions all the way around. So all the opinions that you received were clean. For journal entries, you had one adjusting journal entry that was raised by us, the auditors. In internal controls, there was one material weakness identified related to that post-closing entry. I did want to mention that we have full cooperation with management. They were wonderful to work with. Anytime we needed something, they made sure we had it. Anytime we had a question, they were very quick to make sure that we had the information that we needed to complete the audit. So I very much appreciate that. And on the final slide, this is my contact information. I am happy to answer any and all questions you have now, but we serve at the pleasure of the board, not just now, not just when we're doing the audit, but throughout the year. So my information is there. I'm happy to take questions now and at any time during the year.
Thank you, Lauren.
Lauren's input in terms of the year-end code, reconciliation and adjustment that was needed. So part of the corrective action we took and work a lot more closely with the bookkeeper for the next year, so that our quarterly report that from the bookkeeper reconcile. So that's correct. I'll be happy to entertain any other questions like that, but our goal is always definitely not it. Quarterly, that's sure. Do you want to also thank Jessica Lewis, who took over the reins of conducting this audit this year for us, with the retirement of Ron Hospital last November. So she did yeoman's work gathering all the materials for the auditor. Well, and I also want to thank Terry Becker himself for expediting the audit, getting it done and prepared for all the hard work and effort that.
Questions for Ed? All right, hearing none, this is an action item. I entertain a motion to recommend policy board accept the FY 2021 annual program audit report and financial statement. Program will approve. The motion, we have a second. The motion and a second, any objection? Hearing none, motion carries. Item 5. Acceptance of the quarterly financial report for 2022.
Thank you, Lauren. On page 12 of your packet is the first quarter report for fiscal year 2022. As you can see, in terms of overall revenues and expenditures, we're pretty much on track for quarter away through the fiscal year. In terms of expenses, there are a couple of things I want to point out. In terms of overall revenues to the program, we're still expecting a couple of membership fees for this fiscal year from board members, but that is going to happen probably over the next couple of weeks before we invoice for a lot of membership fees. We're also anticipating to receive the time documentation that occurs as support for our work plan year to fully round out the revenue that we receive from the the two notes that I have, or the 2 or 3 notes I have in terms of the expense side. The first one on insurance, we basically prepaid the first part policy for this year. That's why we're collecting 75% will get budgeted. So if you would receive a policy renewal sometime in summer, we have to pay the first quarter this year and the remaining 3 quarters this year. So this expense category for insurance is reflects us closing out that policy for this current fiscal year, but we'll have 1 quarter statement later on. Regarding printing and sponsored conferences, those I just pulled out from the expense categories because they relate primarily to some of our events that we've been conducting. The 30th anniversary was being held in combination with phase 7, so went through in October. So we're just recognizing some expenses related to that event, and we'll have
Chris? All right, hearing none, this is also an action item, recommend the policy board accept the quarterly financial report. A motion to that effect.
Aaron Brown, so moved.
Second. Any objection? Hearing none, motion carries. Item 6 on the agenda, approval of operating procedure manual update.
Yeah, this is mostly a housekeeping item. Our existing operating procedure manual has a lot of references to the program administrator, and as I mentioned, just before the service of that position retired in November, so we went through and did some updates to reflect our new management team, which is myself, my work as assistant director, and just Lewis as the program support specialist. So those are, various minor updates throughout the operating procedure manual. It also reflects sort of the line of authority in terms of our internal and external accounting practices to reflect the current staffing among the staff members. And then there's only just some minor updates as definitions of expenses to align with the quarterly budget, quarterly financial report that we presented. Your volunteer services that are now recognized as part of our EPA reporting that we're operating procedure. And all fairly straightforward in terms of updates that manual. If you have to entertain any questions, the links to those changes are in the packet. Have to bring them. There are.
Questions? All right, so the recommendation is for the policy board to approve the update to the operating procedure manual. The motion? There's a motion and a second. Are there any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Item 7, comprehensive conservation management plan 2022, interlocal contract report.
So good morning. EPA requires that we revisit the CCIP every 5 years to make sure that it is updated and relevant for the issues that we are experiencing here in our watershed. Believe it or not, it feels like yesterday, but it's actually coming up on 5 years since we adopted the updated CCIP back in 2017. So back in December, we did issue a request for proposals for a technical support contractor to help us with the public engagement, research, and writing of that 2022 update. We included several different potential tasks that respondents could bid on. That includes just updating the actions and activities and the goals that are included in the 2017 CCIP to reflect those things that we adopted in interim, like the Habitat Master Plan and so forth. We also recognize that there has been new executive orders on environmental justice, and so we are looking for support to make sure that those actions are appropriately included in an updated CCMP. We also know that there is several climate change actions in our CCMP that have been, the vulnerability assessment has been completed, but the adaptation action strategies have not been updated. So we wanted a contractor to help look at those aspects. We also know that you all have had several discussions about potentially expanding the boundary of the Tampa Bay Estuary program study area. So we wanted to begin to initiate some conversations around stakeholder engagement and evaluation of what that might mean, because that can have a consequence for the type of way that we approach the CCMP update. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but we wanted that task to be clearly included in the RFP. And then to provide graphic design services to update the CCMP to incorporate all of those new changes. Those were the tasks that we have requested services for. And we had three respondents. We had a great pool of reviewers from folks that really haven't been active in reviewing proposals for our program before. That included Diego Guerra from Plant Hillsborough, Jessica Stempian from the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, Angela Collins from Manatee County, and myself. So we reviewed those 3 proposals, and ultimately the findings of that review committee were, they were unanimous that the proposal from Schaefer Consulting was the strongest proposal. However, that committee did find that some of those tasks identified with task 2 related to environmental justice would require that team to bring on additional expertise in order to successfully accomplish the work contemplated in that task. And in particular, the committee did note the importance of the community leaders that they have identified in their proposal. It would be important for those community leaders providing that expertise to be compensated accordingly. So not just paying the consultant, but having folks in the community also compensated. So those were the findings that were shared with Ed as the executive director. The scores are all included here in this additional packet item. But essentially, the staff recommendation is that we authorize the executive director to negotiate a scope and enter into a contract with Schaefer Consulting for an amount not to exceed $79,950. And then the standard recommending that the policy board authorize the executive director to amend the scope of budget up to $25,000 should those funds become available. With that, I'm happy to entertain any discussion or questions.
This is Karen Brown. Mine is staff still recommending number B there, that negotiations cannot be successful to engage in negotiations with the second ranking.
No, the updated staff recommendation, which was included in the handout, it's up on the screen as well.
Okay, sorry.
We don't think that item was necessary based on the proposals that we received. And we're pretty confident that we'll be able to successfully negotiate with the top ranked respondent, Schaefer Consulting.
Thank you for clarifying.
Question, 79,950 include the cost for the third party to bring in?
Yeah, so it's our intent to negotiate on that, but yes, it would include that, not to exceed. Some of the reviewer comments were, they felt that the level of effort between tasks could be altered to accommodate that kind of approach.
Any other questions or comments? So, again, just to be clear, the motion is to recommend the items that are on the updated agenda papers and so the action is to recommend the policy board authorize the executive director to negotiate the scope and enter into contract with Schaefer Consulting for an amount not to exceed $79,950. And part B, to recommend the policy board authorize the executive director to amend the scope and budget up to $25,000 if additional funds become available. Do I hear a motion to that? Motion. Are there any objections? And I think at this point we are jumping to item
Correct.
11.
Guide some of the negotiations in terms of the program area expansion that has been contemplated in the past by the management conference. So we kind of going to walk through and outline what we've heard from some of our technical advisory committee members so far on this topic, and also guide you through a menu here that might end up on the screen, and that will everyone participates here in the management conference to identify what's in the management board is on. Without further ado, if you look up at the screen and you have a smartphone available, I encourage you to go to that site now. You go to justmenti.com and then bring the code, or the QR code works on your smartphone, that should take you to that area as well. A little bit of time starting this conversation, recognizing that we're going through this interim update right now with EPA or CCMP, but then also recognizing that a major revision of the CCMP will probably happen around the 2027 timeframe. So those are sort of the timelines for operating under this consideration. Again, here's the word.
Is everybody getting there okay?
They need a Wi-Fi password.
Look over there. Does anybody need the Wi-Fi password?
I think we'll start with that. Yeah, should.
I just don't want to lose the code screen. Is it moving now on your phone?
Yeah. Everyone get it down? Everyone need more time? With the advanced file,
Oh,
as long as you're on the minute, that's how we're able to get that.
everybody at Menti? All right, so, and kind of stole the thunder, but I'll say it anyway. You know, y'all brought this issue up during the strategic plan, when we updated the strategic plan back in 2020. And that this discussion about should we expand the boundaries to include some of the portions of the northern Gulf of Mexico side of the region. But that was raised by policy board members as well as some of you in the room as something that we ought to consider. But there wasn't like strong consensus that that was something we definitely ought to do. And ultimately, the strategic plan ended up reflecting this language that we recognize that we can do that if we all come together and agree on it. That it might change the partnership dynamic in terms of who's at the table, what the funding splits are, and that geographic scale has consequences for how much capacity and how much work that the program can do as a small and lean organization. So I think we all agree that was a true statement, and those were the kinds of parameters that we would consider if we decided to advance this conversation any further. So why now? Because we're embarking on this five-year update of the CCMP, and some of the requirements for the CCMP, not only does it need to be vetted by community members, by you all as our management conference, the technical advisory committee, the community advisory committee, and our policy board, but it also is reviewed by our partners at EPA. And they have guidance for us in terms of what constitutes a minor update versus a major revision. And so we could approach our CCMP update as a minor update this time because it's only been 5 years, not that much has changed. We know that there's like several small things that maybe need to be updated or changed in an action, but I don't know that there's like really huge new things that needed to get incorporated in the CCMP that we adopted back in 2017. We're all just starting to get familiar and living with and implementing that document. But if we are committed to this idea of expanding the study area boundary for the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, then that's going to bump us into this category of major revisions. Because in addition to all of the background work that we've already done to describe the state of water quality, natural resources, the population, the threats, all of that work has not necessarily been done for these areas which we would be considering bringing into our boundaries. So that necessitates this additional level of review from EPA in terms of what what the updated CCMP document might look like. So we want you all to kind of understand that context, and that's why we're advancing this discussion now, so we can prepare ourselves for how we need to approach updating the CCMP and time things accordingly. So just to acquaint everyone, this is the current study area boundary for the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. It includes sort of, it's a little bit of a hybrid of some of the hub codes, but the big things that are left out here are some of the Gulf of Mexico coastal portions of Pasco County, some of the Anclote River watershed, and the watershed that drains to Clearwater Harbor and St. Joseph Sound. So just for purposes of discussion, what we've been kind of putting out there is these three areas that we might want to consider incorporating into our boundaries. So we'd like to get your feedback on some of these ideas. In the purple, you see the area that drains to Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound. The red is more or less the Anclote River watershed. And then while the orange is portions of the Pasco Gulf Coast, largely the Piscataqui watershed, all the way up to Double Hammock Creek. There are things that are left out. This is not a formal boundary by any stretch of the imagination. It's conceptual to give you an idea. And there's plenty of play for change in terms of what people are interested in discussing, considering, and potentially including into a future boundary expansion. But those are the kind of areas that we've honed in on to frame this discussion. So we approach this topic now with both the Technical Advisory Committee and the Community Advisory Committee. The major feedback from the Technical Advisory Committee was that Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound, all the way up to Anclote Key, that kind of makes sense. The seagrass resources are fairly similar. They're more or less monitored face of the water on a similar time scale. And there is also already an EPA approved CCMP in place for Clearwater Harbor and St. Joseph Sound. When we got to discussing those areas north of Anclote Key, there was a significant amount of discussion about how different the seagrass resources are for that part of the Gulf Coast. Namely that the shelf is very shallow, 20 miles, extends like up to 20 miles into the Gulf of Mexico. And so that presents some different constraints in terms of what people are capable of monitoring. And in general, monitoring was a concern, knowing that there's not the same ambient water quality monitoring program and seagrass transect contributions going on in that part of Pasco County. While in areas of Clearwater Harbor and St. Joseph Sound, there is routine ambient water quality monitoring going on and that kind of seagrass transect monitoring as well. So those were just some of the differences and the things that the TAC expressed in terms of considering this expansion. The Community Advisory Committee had a really valuable conversation where they provided a lot of different insights into this potential boundary expansion. And so they noted that they viewed Clearwater Harbor as connected to Bocaciega Bay. They thought that it was appropriately inclusive and reflects the fact that we are one regional community, and that this would be particularly helpful for new residents as well as visitors, just to sort of have one unified set of environmental messaging. There was some concern, they're very protective over their Bay Mini Grants program, and there was some concern that if we changed the study area boundary, that it might direct more funding towards the Gulf of Mexico and away from Tampa Bay. So it was sort of a zero-sum game that they were concerned about, and they were wanting to make sure that Tampa Bay was still getting the resources it needed in terms of community engagement and community projects. There were also some longtime Community Advisory Committee members who were fairly concerned about staff being stretched too thin. They know that we're a small team. They were already covering a fairly large geography, and they were concerned about what would happen if we had to cover even more ground with the staff that we have. And to that point, they were fairly adamant that if we were going to expand, there would need to be some sort of follow through, a way to bring in additional revenue to support that kind of expansion. And so, they weren't sure how that would happen, but they identified that as something that was probably needed. So the intent today is to walk them through a structured set of questions, but if y'all feel comfortable and also want to just like offer brief thoughts or discussion at the end, that's absolutely fine. The idea is to add in a slide to this talk, to the policy board that sort of synthesizes the feedback that we hear from you all, so that they also, in addition to hearing from the TAC and the CAC, they'll also hear the thoughts of the management board and considering this sort of thing. So I mentioned some of the reasons that we're having this discussion now because of the CCMP review process and the distinction between a minor and a major update or revision. But another thing that we need to be concerned about is the interlocal agreement that we all just renewed our commitment to the Tampa Bay Upstream program to working together for a healthy bay. We know that any changes to the interlocal agreement require unanimous support. So we're going to be, whatever kinds of conversations and things, like people need to all get on the same page, whichever direction that we go. That's going to be an important part of this. And we know that the interlocal agreement is one of the ways that we set up the structure for how we provide financial support to the program. So to this question, this point that the CAC raised about how do we bring in additional financial resources to support a potential expansion, I think one of the questions that we would like to know from you all is, should those resource limitations, those financial resource limitations be addressed by adding funding partners via a joiner to the interlocal agreement? Kind of like we did back in the 2010s, where we brought in a few other funding partners. We would contemplate maybe bringing in some communities that are from this expanded boundary, whether that's like Dunedin, approaching Dunedin to see if they might be interested, or adding additional funding support from those of you who are already at the table, but that part of your population that's not currently served by our study area would go in towards the funding equation. So that's sort of what this question is about. Should we address these funding resource limitations by adding partners via a joiner to the interlocal agreement? And Ed, do you want to weigh in on this one at all?
On this discussion, depending on the geographic boundary and whatever. Initially, a change in our local agreement if we work from our county question. If we were to expand to other municipalities, then going to expect it for that addition. But regardless, if we were to expand, we have to update it. That's sort of the bottom line of the question. It's a matter of timing right now in terms of starting in additional work from municipalities outside of what's at the table, and whether or not that would jive with this interim update or an update further. That sort of timing question is a difficult one. Right now, I don't think we can accomplish it. During this interim update, it would take some time to generate those relationships and move it through municipality board, then all your boards again in terms of an updated interlocal agreement. So realistically, we probably can accomplish all that in the 2022 interim update. But we could, if it's the consensus of the board, set the stage for that to happen.
And also consider that if we bring in new entities by joiner, then they're sitting at the table and voting.
Kelly,
I guess my question is this: the way this is worded, are you saying like dependent on how much it costs to add that whole thing, that those entities would have to fund that? Because I think how it's done now is kind of a combination of the dollars that yes you receive from us, but also what you receive from EPA. So it's not like all of us in here at the table, our organizations are wholly funding the ESRI program. So the way that that's worded, it seems like if you add those folks in, they have to shoulder the entire cost, and I don't think that's entirely would be an equitable approach. And some of those cities are very small.
Yeah, the funding table would definitely need to be revised, and so the way I'm looking at it, budgeting wise, right now in our interlocal agreement, we have a 200% consideration of operational costs for the next 5 years. absorb this New York would be down. So that 2.5% increase, probably more likely about 4% increase to absorb that new staffing. And that would, at that point, be spread among partners based on the population distribution of the geographic, any new geographic. So it wouldn't entirely be on the burden of the but it would change everyone's current allocation.
Yeah, what I was going to say was, and I'm not sure how you plan on approaching this, but should we have this discussion before voting? I think you're probably already mentioned, we can discuss that. I'm just wondering if while we're discussing things, items will pop up in people's heads. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't think of that, so it may inform the vote more.
Yeah, from my perspective, this is the tool to help engender the conversation to make sure that it's not crickets. So it's really the pleasure of the board. I'm pretty flexible and can roll however. I'm just trying to listen to you guys to fill it. So.
Well, is there any other comments for that? Or
There are a couple.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the campaign approach started with our focus on we know there are management strategies. And of course, regulatory changes, requirements, all of jurisdictions moved up into the more correction criteria. My question is, how do you the real question is how the management strategy would change when you go on the does it end with what we're already doing, or is it going to change drastically? Because of the management situation that we're going to down here, it kind of reminds me of what's happening down in the old Charlotte Harbor. Which is now closing the Parkland, it's so huge, and there's so many different, totally different ways to do. So are we ready to make those adjustments in management strategies to move away from? So we have, we're in basic.
I think the short answer is that it's not entirely, a lot of that characterization work that Mike mentioned would have to be done for some of these areas. There's a leg up in terms of value over carbon. But it's sort of that there would still need some updates for that. So there would be some work that we need to do.
We are actually doing an update now. We received funding from the Water Management District for updating the CCMP for Interlocal conversations.
And to that point, one of the comments in the chat is from Felicia, who said that she just wants to be clear that the CCMP for Clearwater Harbor St. Joseph Sound is not an EPA 320 recognized CCMP, although Nancy Larson did collaborate on the development of that proposal. It's still a distinct kind of document that will need to get incorporated into something else if that's the direction of the board. Tom, before your list, we have another comment in the chat about whether or not this question is about expanding the study area boundary, or if we do expand, should there be financial support handled through joiners? And I think it's sort of hard to untangle those. And so I would say the way that it's worded is generally to assess how you all feel about adding funding partners through the joiner, whether that's a strategy to support boundary expansion or a strategy to bring additional resources to the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. We brought folks to the table before to sort of expand the resources that we have available to us. And there is some interest from some other entities, both outside of our current study area boundary and within our current study area boundary, that might be considering that. So you know, we're interested in the question from the perspective of expansion of the study area boundary, but also in general, how do you all feel about bringing more folks to the table if they bring financial resources with them?
Can I do my list off?
Yes, please do.
And actually, this time, a lot of the same concerns already been expressed. Staffing and workload was chief among them for me. And I think we all agree that this was probably such a thing that set up. The workload, if there's not an assumed expansion of staff, then you know, current workload that you deal with is manageable right there.
Depends on who you ask.
So Marcus, is the current workload manageable?
That's why you ask.
So I do have concerns about the money would have to come with those things. It can't just be money in and of itself. It has to come with additional staffing, additional resources. Kelly had mentioned one of my concerns about the funding for Pinellas County and City of Clearwater in particular. You know, they're already at the table. So how much are we really gaining by expanding? However, as I mentioned, it's all population driven. So certainly they're, you know, they're building. And what the expansion allows for those things. One of my big concerns is just the ripple effect on current programs, the RA document in particular. You know, how is there a way of isolating that, and so is it all going to get commingled? I think there are a lot of details that could, you know, from if a year from now we've got new partners and you know, that. The RA document is one of the big ones for me, and all the space is something. You know, what would be the effect on the nitrogen management? What would be the effect on the CAC? What would be the effect on the tax? You know, so I'm a little, I'd like more information on that, if that's possible. But, you know, it is a concern. And Rob mentioned, you know, just the whole watershed aspect. I feel like we're trying to get pulled away from our roots. This was supposed to be an estuary program for the California estuary at its watershed. And a geographic expansion of that outside of the watershed could be, yeah, it's bigger, it could be more expensive than what I'm coming in, but it really addresses the original mission of the organization. So that's it for now.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Pat said, I'm starting to think about it too. I mean, starting with
Can you
basic.
grab a mic so that people, thank you.
We started with, you know, base segments and then moved up to the watershed. There's a hydrologic base. And, you know, resources, technical things are looked at in more detail. But I'm all for more partners and resource management, but I'm not clear exactly what the goal of that are, other than bringing in partners from the community. My concept would be stop, you know, start going outside the watershed and start adding areas. Just looking at habitats or other things. That can just continue. So I think it's some consideration. Maybe it's the steps of the path, which is some consideration of the benefits to the resource management, and then also the benefits to, you know, Dallas County, you know, the members. So there's a lot of things to consider. Besides whether we can amend the local leaders. And then the other comment about the management, everyone that participates in the estuary program actually seems like, you know, they give the ultimate conveyance. There's a lot of things going on in these areas that we're talking about. So it's seems like they're connected. maybe all that's going to be considered part of it.
No, there are more questions, don't worry.
And then the other, the other big one that's coming long term is sea-level rise, is bringing those areas to the Tampa Bay. So, I mean, it will be.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think they align with Rob was saying, whether or not management paradigm developed along the coastal watershed makes sense. Constructs, does it make sense to incorporate into the map reasonable document for those new areas? I can't answer that question right now because we have to understand sort of where the targets are at. The biggest connection I made when this came up with the TAC was we currently have a strategy in the existing CCMP that's trying to get a sustainable base gallon population in Tampa Bay. That sustainable base gallon population very much continues that seagrass resources in the river to the south are stable and allow for base gallon proliferate into the future. Those are the larvae that are seeding our base gallon population. That's the one major connection that I made in terms of the existing CCMP and the resource that we have made proper. Hydrologically, there's distinct and separate, I think, issues associated with those watersheds. To the extent they align with their existing processes, regional firms and NMC, I think we can make those connections as well, but there's additional work that we would have to do and provide additional justification to DEP.
Yeah, to follow up on that, if we do this for now, really, one way or another, to me, it's a bit of a distraction. And just deciding whether you're going to add or expand or you're not, it's taking staff energy, staff mental energy and capacity and time and things. You know, we're struggling to meet the reasonable assurance document requirements in Old Tampa Bay, and meet our nitrogen goals in that part of the day. And kind of at the forefront of a lot of what's going on right now. And just dealing with the housekeeping and mechanics and questioning whether we should or whether we shouldn't, all of that to me is a distraction from what we need to be looking at, which is making sure that 2022, 2023, we're back under that 9.3 milligrams per budget. So, that's my soapbox.
Okay, well, I'm gonna try to knock you off your soapbox. Just kidding. No, I know, I don't know how many times we've had this conversation in the past, so. One, I think there's a lot of information that folks here in the room don't know because we don't have conversations about Clearwater representation and sound in this area. So to know the amount of science, the amount of work that Pinellas County, City of Dunedin, Clearwater, Largo have partnered together to basically build a model that is like linked to the ESHRE program. We've used that model so that we are collecting the data. We have a separate agreement with the Water Management District called the Seagrass Aerials that is done at the exact same time. All of those frameworks are in place. We have Tony and Nikki and team as our partner. They developed our monitoring program that all of the local governments contribute to. The county does the monitoring and Tony and team do all of our analytics. And they're put out in a very similar fashion. So again, they keep trying to create that kind of uniform message. As a government that is split between Tampa Bay and the other side, we try to keep messaging consistent because, people move in Pinellas County. We talk to them all the time. I was talking to somebody who's like living up in the East Lake area and has now moved into unincorporated Seminole, which is more on Bay. and how incredibly different even just, North County to South County is, from an environmental perspective. And so for consistency of messaging, I mean, water knows no boundaries. And yes, some of that water ends up in Tampa Bay and some of that water ends up in Boca Bay, which by the way is not part of the NFC. But we still keep to the principles of reducing the loads and the messaging and the education and the beef flirting and all of those things we try to marry together. The scoop, the food. We implemented that campaign on the other side by ourselves. But again, that reinforcing messaging. People move. People drive. I live over outside of the watershed. I drive and I work in the watershed over here in Tampa Bay. So, I think it helps continue to drive the messaging about the Bay, but our overarching water quality issues here, they are not unique to Tampa Bay. We are having some of the same challenges and seeing nitrogen concentrations going up in Clearwater Harbor that we're trying to figure out. That's one of the reasons why we're doing the update to the CCMP is what all of a sudden changed. But those frameworks are in place. And I think that a lot of folks in this room just maybe don't know about it because we've really never shared it because it's not a topic of this group or the TAC, frankly. But I think if folks actually saw all of the science and all of the model that we use, the Tampa Bay Estuary Program model that we applied to the other side of the coast, I think you'd be pretty impressed.
So I think that's
On the soapbox.
I think that's an important contribution, though, that when a partner is doing the work in a way that's consistent with what's happening in the Bay, that's one thing. But it's also important, to understand that same level of effort is not already going on for that whole area that we're considering. And that's not our model as the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, that we would step in and become, to do somebody's ambient water quality monitoring or somebody's seagrass transect. So that would be laid out in any kind of boundary expansion, that's the responsibility of the partner that would be coming in. And, for some that might be easier to handle than others.
Yeah, that was good stuff, though. And I think that is really important. So I don't know how you capture that. Everybody. I can totally relate to the challenges of what now talking about those issues. The operate works wise, the counties. You want to have the messaging and science things that go with it. I guess some additional examples of how it benefits resource management. Whether it's value, health issue, there are others, those types of things. And I have seen a lot of the work up there that you guys have done in the modeling. It is amazing stuff. So there's probably some contribution from that for the stuff. So anyway, I guess I'm not sure what we're voting now.
This isn't a vote, this is just a discussion item. We moved it up in the agenda, but right now we're asking this question about bringing additional partners to the table, additional funding partners to the table, and whether or not you're for that or against that. And I'm pushing you into there is more questions. So this is great because you're doing it without the guided inquiry. But I'm pushing you into a binary because of the fact that if it is tied to the interlocal, it needs to be unanimous. So this isn't a final vote on anything, but it's letting me know the temperature of the partners that are currently at the table. So I know how close to unanimous we are or are not.
Maya, does this question pretty much relate to the boundary being expanded, or is this just isolated to bringing in additional funding?
I'm okay with you approaching it from either way, is what I said. I know that's not super important, but we could bring additional partners in via joinder anyways. And so I'm interested to know how you feel about that and how you feel about it connected to an expansion. But
two separate questions, one including any.
It's just one. I don't have a second one though. So if you want to add in your notes.
Those are two different things.
If there's a slide and you can provide your comments and if you clarify how you approach this question, then I can kind of understand that a little bit. Unless y'all have a way you'd like to approach this question collectively.
Talking agree with Kelly. I've been doing this for 30 years, for the Tampa Bay School, Sarasota Bay School, and Charlotte. But that's been our job, is to try to make sure that whatever management strategy we have in the northern part of the county, here, meets what's happening in the southern part of the county. So that can be done. But I just see, I see that as something different than what you're trying to expand beyond that. So is it all or nothing, or one or the other, or?
It's not all or nothing.
We'll get to some of those questions.
So, but the idea here is, yes, if you're resource restricted because of funding, any lawyer should, my opinion, bring the resource. That's,
And it seems like a conversation that's necessary, right? If we are going to expand our geographic footprint, it necessitates additional staff and resources. So either everyone at the table is going to need to fill in that missing piece of the financial pie, or these additional partners will have to come in. There's no adding to the workload of the current budget.
And the question
Would be a stretch.
But I think the point is that this is saying that we would add funding even without the expansion, that's a potential response to this question. That's one.
Yeah, I think feedback we're hearing, there's distinctions and that's really, we're at for both of those. If you this question for both of those lenses. And for when we originally developed this was giving us an idea of your this is where general agreement. That's the mechanism to change the dynamic of funding partnerships. And if there's a consensus around that, there's work that we need to do before we even talk about the geographic boundary expansion.
So on this question, the research limitation, can you further define those, like what you're talking about? For me, that's like, I not really understand. Money and people. Money and people.
And timing of workload that we have come down the pipe, as we mentioned, we're wrapping up our document by that this year. We're going to have to start a program evaluation with EPA next year on our existing CCP. We're trying to do that all at the same time with loading new areas, characterizing the areas based on data. And that's going to stretch it.
The thing, support for this question could mean that partners, funding partners come in without spending that could be a logical step after.
We recognize now, I think, from the feedback that we need to refine this question.
But this is an open discussion, and we're not making a staff recommendation, we're not deciding anything today. This is for you all to tell us if that's something that you support or not support. The both of the ways that it's been interpreted here, let us know what you're thinking. I can change this presentation before the policy board to reflect additional clarity, but it's really useful to hear what you all think about whether or not that additional funding and partnership is tied to boundary expansion, or if it's just another way to support bringing in additional resources to the program. Both, your feedback on both of those is valued.
And one thing I want to highlight, when I was on my soapbox about, just the, and I apologize to both Kelly and Ralph for saying this, the unintended consequence. Could come from this. I had a specific example during briefing a number of things where, I think about, well, even if you did expand, we say it as a concept in the room, but can we expand? Does the physical space we currently allow for that? The answer I got was no, and we just renewed our lease in the Interlocal. So even if you did say, well, we're getting all this extra money, we could hire as soon as we get this staff. There's no place to put them once we start operating that. And so, it's just little things like that I want to just throw out
important to clarify your values now during these discussions. How do you want us as a staff, we're serving you all as our management community. Do you want our brain power and our energy to go towards this expansion, to be able to bring this expertise to these other areas too? Or do you want us, to spend time working on the things that we're already, working to accomplish for the region as well? Just understand that's the trade-off. That was what we agreed to in the strategic plan. And so now we're trying to push you to agree on the next step. So what do we do so this question isn't lingering? So I'm going to ask you all to answer the question that I know you don't like.
Can I just make a comment?
Sure.
It seems like, I feel like this is, I don't want to say being rushed, but it's coming up against, we're discussing this in light of things that are about to happen in a shorter time frame. And it seems like the whole idea of whether or not to expand those geographic boundaries is being, it needs to be considered in the framework of resources, but is that the place to start? So you have those 3 regions that are being proposed. And I think it would make more sense, even if it requires taking more time and stretching out this discussion, to kind of consider from a resource standpoint, the merits of expansion in terms of what those, boundaries need, or the degree of connectivity to the existing geographic boundary, and to what extent those areas actually influence what you're trying to do in May. The thing about the scallops, I'm sure there's other things, the nitrogen coming into Charlotte, to Clearwater Harbor, does that end up in Mobile Bay? From a scientific standpoint, is it something that makes sense or that you want to do? And then you can discuss, well, what does that mean in terms of resource needs? Obviously, you need additional resources. How do you get there? Maybe it's a short-term picture, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's longer term. But I had a more directed question, and this is just my experience with SRA program. If you expand your geographic boundaries, does that affect federal funding? No, not at all. Okay, so it's completely the back. Well, I just think that kind of voting out of in the sense of the overwhelming workload it's going to convey is probably the wrong place to start.
So we're not, I just want to be really clear, we're not voting on anything today. This is an activity to facilitate discussion, which y'all don't need because you're doing it on your own. We're asking these questions because there has been requests from policy board members in particular, but also some management board partners to consider expanding the boundaries. We had this discussion during the strategic plan, and the mechanisms to do that are sort of like there's all these stacked processes that we're talking about. The interlocal agreement, which when we had all those discussions about the interlocal agreement, it was kind of brought up then, but then there was no consensus again. So now the question of should we expand is still hanging out there. Now we're coming up against another timeline where we have to update the CCMP. So this is another opportunity to start to address, if you really want us to do this, this is an opportunity to start. We have not developed a staff recommendation, but we're not saying we think you ought to do this. We're trying to get you early in the process to gather your feedback. And I guess what I am pushing you towards is a clear answer, rather than leaving this hanging for, every 5 years we revisit it. I'm trying to get to a point of, do I need to knuckle down and make this my work for right now? Is this something that we can work towards over the next 5 years? Or is this something that doesn't really make sense for our estuary program? And should we stop having this conversation? And so I have a series of these questions that are trying to structure walking us through that. But there's absolutely no obligation to expand the boundaries over the next 8 months. If you feel strongly and there's strong consensus about it, we have an opportunity to do that in the next 8 months because we're updating the CCMP. But if there's another way we'd like to approach it, those kinds of clarifying questions are really helpful to tee that up, because this is your program, and what you all want and the guidance you provide the policy board, I think, will be heard and valued. So this is the time to sort of provide the clarity that we need in terms of how to deal with this like question that's been kind of hanging out there for a while. So.
The CCMP, like this contract that we're setting up with somebody, is where potential expansion is concerned, that it's more like, yeah, it's still exploratory. Should that be part of it?
Right. And I haven't negotiated the scope yet. You all have authorized us to work on that. But if part of the feedback is, you know what, it doesn't seem like this is the right time, then I can take some of the budget that they're currently allocating for their time toward that and spread it somewhere else. So that's kind of, you know, it's helping me set up what this CCMP update looks like. It's not forcing, you know, a particular outcome over the next 8 months necessarily, but it helps me understand what that agreement is going to look like.
That's what I was going to ask also. The task force, I think it makes sense to keep that, to try to answer the question that with the goal of maybe having an answer by the next, like in 3-4 years when we're looking at the new dues and the, you know, when is that, in 4 years from now?
So our goal for that interim update would be to come back to the board at the November meeting for the final document that's approved by both management and all.
But
whether or not that's the groundwork for this expansion or not is, I think, there's going to be another conversation that will be in August with the help of that contract to get it to that point. Yes, we should be addressing it. No.
And her question was the interlocal agreement is, you know, going to come up for, has that sunset review again in 4.5 years. So that would be another point where if we have an end goal that we're working towards, we could spend the next 4 years developing that background. If that's the consensus of the boards, that, you know, that would provide a timeline for how to accomplish these things. I think it would be an incredible, I mean, if there was everybody in the room was super on board and that was what you really wanted us to do, even then it would be a very hard lift to accomplish this in 8 months. Not impossible, but you know, there's some level of this, and I have, you know, that's all fair conversation.
I appreciate that comment on the 8 months, because that was one of the things that was mentioned. We're talking about resources, we're also talking about, I know, that all funds are pretty good, and at this point, I think that's what we need to be in the 8 months, we know that process. It's, we all realistically, I think it's going to come. We have quite a good agenda of resources. If we can take a step back and just think about this discussion on the element of we want to review it, look at higher, it's going to come back up in the next 1 month, as well as the next updates of the plan itself. So the strategic plan towards that, but just a higher level discussion, that's what we're reviewing. Because we will continue to have these discussions. You know, are there visions consistent to the actual program? What would it take to bring that to mind? Where's the money at? What we move towards? You know, the element, maybe a shorter time, it's a consistency of the way how you've been managing it from this point to the region. So I was important in that aspect of continue to look at it, but I would not support the 8 months thing.
And our CCMP update ends in 26. So it's a 4-year project that we just got funding for. So that might be in line with that same timeline.
Yeah, and I agree with Rajesh, this is not something that would be accomplished in 8 months. And I just to be clear, I never thought that would be a reasonable timeline. I didn't really talk about timelines. I was more talking about the overarching discussion about, you know, moving the boundary. But again, if this group and the policy board said, yes, let's plan for that over an period, that would give us the opportunity to work with Water Management District and everyone to make sure that the work that we're doing furthers that effort so that there isn't such a heavy lift on the team.
I know that we've been having this conversation internally for a long time, and I think I know where Kelly stands But as far as the other cooperators, as far as the other potential cooperators, is the estuary program actively engaged in conversations with them as well, so that we know outside of.
The other entity, I think Clearwater is very supportive of expanding the boundary well, like Sarah, maybe weigh in on that.
Yeah, we are very supportive of expanding the boundary. Like Kelly mentioned, we have the same messages across the city, and I feel like, given the RA issues that we have, like some of those issues could be promoted citywide a little bit better, including the other side. You know, with Clearwater Beach, and like people are so focused on Clearwater Beach, and so having a cohesive message that there are some things that you can do as an individual to help as well, I certainly be a good message citywide, people not just focusing on just Clearwater Harbor on that side of the city. And yeah, it's several of our elected officials.
And then Juanita is on the line virtually. I don't know if she wants to weigh in, but that's the other partner in this boundary expansion area. And from their elected officials, you know, that it was Commissioner Wells from Pasco County that initiated this and felt pretty strongly. And Commissioner Mariano is the new rep on our board, and I think also feels similarly that there's interest. And so that's me. You all are what's driving this conversation being at the table. It's not like us advancing it. We're trying to be responsive to the requests that we're getting from you and our partners.
I guess a few comments. It sounds to me like there's interest in shared science, interest in shared messaging, but it's a boundary expansion necessary for both of those to happen. I'm sure you're cooperating with Pinellas County and sharing science with region and state and country. So with the boundary expansion required to meet these goals that Pinellas and Clearwater may have. That would be my comment. Component of shared science and messaging.
I think the question of what the project is, you know, like a hard controller project is much different than this or going out the goals, maybe it's just maybe problem. But messaging around the meridian, pipe up campaign, propeller scarring, and just the community, you know, remote communities, awareness of environmental issues, and those messages are recurring this year. We need to develop those with the broad region line, not just the watershed.
And I think it's a benefit to all of the resources in the area to have the expertise of the estuary program. You know, so we are seeing high nitrogen on the whole west coast, with folks giving all the way up into the Water Harbor now. So whatever's going on through that whole area, and it is connected. And so Sig is already part of the estuary program. So, you know, I think it'd be nice to look at it more holistically. And again, you know, you guys have done a great job managing Tampa Bay nitrogen, and I think we need to do the same thing on the other side.
So Maya, your task force kind of maybe could cover a lot of this stuff, but I don't know what the detailed scope is. Is your concern that you can't get all that in the time frame of this project?
I don't really have a concern. I'm trying to facilitate some of this stakeholder engagement to set up to help me develop the detailed scope, because I don't have that yet. And also just to start these conversations to give people the space they need to provide clarity and guidance. So, I mean,
That task force could incorporate, identifying, documenting benefits. We're talking about resources on the day, that what we require. You could, depending what your scope is for that task, add these additional things, come back, say, look, here's all benefits for this, resource management gains, here's what we gain, messaging standpoint, all those things.
yeah, and I think we only want to do that if there is some like level of consensus from the board that that's time and money and effort well spent. if there's not consensus about expanding the boundaries to begin with, I'm not sure how much further things need to go.
Has the TAC had an opportunity to, I mean, I know that you've done this with them, but in terms of taking that on, it's like looking at it from the standpoint of resources and how beneficial it would be, or, potentially how everything connects, whether it makes sense.
So the TAC didn't do this kind of activity. The TAC had an open discussion on it. And I would characterize the TAC responses generally not super favorable. They saw the rationale and could make sense of Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound, but there weren't a lot of really supportive comments. It was focused more on that's really different up there and it's a lot more work. That's if I were to boil it down. That's an approach that we could take, is to use the TAC to do some of that exploratory work, but I don't know that that's necessarily in their wheelhouse. That would be part of, if we use this contractor support, they would work with me to help facilitate those kind of discussions for the pieces that the TAC maybe has expertise on beginning to tackle.
Well, that's a big part of it as well, right? Because we've not been including this area, we get a lot of representation from these partners at the TAC meeting to begin with. So as far as, I don't know, if we're looking at the TAC as a representative sample, we're not going to, I wouldn't expect to find a lot of support or knowledge in this area just because we're not pulling from those individuals working in the business with them.
I guess I was just, for an informed, into the decision on whether or not it makes sense. From people, who know a lot about the area and, to what benefit or the goals of the estuary program. And I feel like it's just been some kind of loose discussion to this point and not really thoroughly considered that way, like somebody brave. Like, I think if you're going to do it, you need to be able to explain clearly why you're doing it and what the benefits will be. And I don't feel like I have that information at this point. I mean, part of me thinks, like, I'm kind of supportive of the idea of adding Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound. Only on the basis of what I've heard today. And like,
yeah, I think, that was something kind of what Ed was speaking to earlier. We have some studies that have focused on the connectivity between these areas and Tampa Bay proper, but a lot of the problems that may be limiting that is, a lot of the research that we've gone through TBER, has kind of closed the door, right at this existing boundary. So again, how much existing science can we find on it if we limit the scope of our science to exclude this area? And I think that's part of the conversation, that if we were to move forward, that may be something that we want to emphasize moving forward for future funding opportunities, like looking at connectivity from St. Joseph Sound, Clearwater, and Anclo to Tampa Bay proper. But at this point, one of the reasons that we lack the data is because we also haven't pushed it.
But that's all we're trying, that's really the feedback that we're trying to get right now. Like, I'm coming to you very early in the process. I'm not asking you to make a decision today. It's more to understand, is that worthwhile, in terms of, are you interested enough that we ought to start developing all of those analyses that would support an expansion or not? Because like I said, every time we pose this question, there hasn't really been consensus or clear direction. And I can't even get you enough information to a point where you can make a decision until I get the direction that, yes, we're really interested in this and we want you to put it forward, and this is what we want you to do. So that's the kind of feedback that we're interested in.
It sounds like a path forward based on those comments, whether it's, perhaps that the next act we focus on these specific areas. Kelly is always prepared to speak to the CCMP and what they intend to do in terms of updates, and we just had that conversation, start that conversation, and that's the same for some of these other areas. That would help us, I think, identify where there's significant gap or not enough
we would respond to this next question, which is sort of parsing out those three areas. We're trying to see if there's consensus about going all the way up the coast, or if we should focus in on one area, whether it's Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound, Ankle River watershed, or the Pasco Gulf Coast.
Here we are, you have your hand up. So, you'll have anything.
Yeah, thinking, but only have served on this committee for the past year. We don't have all those proposals on it, but it sounds like this has been brought up multiple times over the past year. Rob kind of addressed some of that earlier, but what were some of the concerns at those points? Why has it not happened yet? Was it a workload issue? Was there not support from the city? I'm not trying to open it kind of hard, but just trying to get an understanding about the historical perspective, and is there things that we're not thinking of that they would just be helpful?
I would say that the feedback has been mixed, and there hasn't been this clear direction for the path forward, which is what we're trying to facilitate today.
I think to your question, all the same statements, all the same conversations have been had over the last, at least my 20 plus years. It's been resources, it's been, does this make sense? You know, everything that's been discussed here today has been discussed, was discussed in the other meetings as well. And I will say that the last time we had this conversation, it was quite a while ago, I think it was actually during the recession. And we had a lot of concerns about congressional support for the estuary program at that time and what may be coming, and concern about longevity funding. But I believe, that the estuary programs have received, actually stronger and more support, since that time. So there was a lot of hesitancy. I do remember it may not have been the last conversation, but one of the conversations we were in recession.
Has there been a look at like the circulation, like, instead of just saying we're going to cut it off at St. Joseph Sound, I mean, has anybody looked to see like current stuff, how far up does that water come down? How far north does it come down?
So look at it hydrologically instead of.
Yeah, so maybe input absolutely really doesn't contribute anything, but maybe it does. I don't know what the current source is there.
I can also add, just, looking at that initial school, on that item, we looked at that, and I was actually incorporating those schools that Rob mentioned. However, we saw that, are they consistent with the center program, or should we actually adapt an analysis of it, that is it really a relationship we should have with those other regions? And they're not actually part of the regional intent. So now we'll just take a step back and really look at the intent of the program. And what I feel is probably the closest relationship, because it is more than county watershed itself. But the other regions north of that is that its own program and intent that should draw relationship to that would be a program and not be included as a boundary plan. If that's but that's part of
There's another comment in the chat from Juanita from Pasco County. She's saying that Pasco County has been interested in the opportunity to expand the boundaries of the estuary program since they joined in 2016. It's something that will greatly benefit the county, providing consistency with the way they approach water quality challenges in both Anklo River and along that coast.
I would say that Bob Weisberg's model, the one that we helped fund with the Restore Act dollars, actually does cover all the way up to at least our country.
Yeah, I think we had the rigidity of it. We had quality looked at how much water from Clearwater Harbor, water quality. We had looked at it.
Marcus to do, right?
He's coming back.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that.
So the last question I have up on the screen just is to get a sense of the timing that you might be supportive of considering this kind of things, whether that's assembling the information that you would need to make an informed decision. And you know, everything between here and now. So do you think that we should strive to change the study area boundary or consider it on that really short, that time scale of the CCMP update, the 8-month time frame? Should we be building in this kind of work over the next, say, 5-year period for a future interlocal agreement update and a future CCMP revision? Or should we put it to bed and just agree to keep the boundary the same?
You know, there's an argument to be made for, you know, Kelly's comment about we that has been around 20 years. To have the tool in the export program toolbox to definitively say the future elected officials who, you know, in this case, and others, usually comes up with policy. So to have that tool in your toolbox to come back and say, yes, we did, and then look at this, we told post-national board policy boards in the past, here's what we found then. To help you either support or squash this topic coming up for the next one. You know, I think there's argument that you were saying, let's do it or not do it. Let's have something to do instead of saying, well, the answer is yeah. So all of those things, but it's really not just one, we still have it. So, you know, oh yeah. So, but I just see us in a new where we're going to be having this conversation. So,
I think we get in place by this fall. Yeah, this is just for.
not the fault of all that.
But it's clear just why we're not.
Yeah.
And as we. If we're still there in the fall, then be that.
Okay, yeah, whatever you guys need to be able to say, we've addressed this, we've gone, as far as we can go with stuff that we're moving on. But I think, quite frankly, that would be enough, when it comes up in the future, I think it would be enough for some elected officials to be able to say, oh, okay, well, just look at it and it doesn't make sense.
Right, what I'm hearing is there's enough interest that it's something that we ought to put together, sort of a packet of materials where you can make an evidence-based decision later on. There's enough interest there. Now, that's just because we put that together, that's not a lock that we're going to expand the boundary. At that point, the decision could go either way, and we'll see where the chips fall at that point. But that's sort of my interpretation of the conversation and these results. So. I have a thing for open thoughts. I think we just need to move on. I guess if you really feel compelled to write them all down, you can, but there's no pressure to do so.
One last thought. If it would be helpful, I mean, I know the TAC doesn't really, have a role, in the decision making, but they are here to vet technical information. So I can ask, Stacy and her team to basically do an overview of the body of work related to some of that area. And so that at least when they, when full thoughts are shared, that they are informed based on actually, data versus, no opinion, but I think I could totally understand and probably would say the same thing if there was this thought that there was like, this is a void and the Ashford program would be responsible for filling that void versus enhancing an already pretty well established program.
I appreciate that suggestion, and I think it was Aaron's as well. I think maybe we could target the June PAC meeting to be focused on this topic. We would invite Pinellas County, Clearwater, maybe Dunedin if they want to come to Pasco County, and they can all sort of talk about what they're currently doing and how that might look. We could begin that assembling of information to assess. We can also help have the facilitation support from our CCMP contractor with that as well.
Thank you, Stacy, for volunteering.
She says in June, so that's me looking out.
Did you like how smooth that was?
I might be on vacation.
Putting my request now.
That wraps it up.
That wraps it up. I really appreciate y'all humoring me and giving me your thoughts so freely. It's really helpful. So thank you.
All right, at this point on the agenda, we're going to back up to item 8, 9, and 10. So item 8 is the executive director staff report.
So just a couple of updates. We are intending to hold the Basis 7 Greenet conference at the end of this month in early March. So if you have not had your staff register, please register now. It closes on February 14th, right? Monday. Correct. So at the stand right now, we have 155 registrants to attend the conference. We're planning on it as primarily in person event with hybrid options for those that can't travel to the region, let's say remotely, both in certain presentations and just in general for the conference overall. So this has been one of our challenging feats to pull off in light of all the circumstances surrounding events such as this. So we appreciate everyone's patience and postpone events, but we're really looking forward to round out, an update of the science for our region, partnership with participant programs, the 28 national programs, will be complementing some of the topical areas for that conference. So please, if you have the interest and you have the resources to attend, please register to attend by next Monday. Other thing I just wanted to mention was at the last management policy board meeting, we brought up the concept of potentially changing our banking relationship with a new bank in St. Pete called Climate First Bank. A lot of their mission aligns with some of the objectives we have identified in CCMP related to climate change resiliency activities. Not only that, they provided us account offerings that are a little bit more competitive than our current banking relationship. At the policy board meeting, there was a question about liquidity of funding. We chose to move our accounts to that bank. And there's a series of questions that are outlined that I put in the packet itself. And from my standpoint, the response they provide back to us, there wouldn't be any sort of issues in terms of liquidity, in terms of our overall account holdings with them at the level that we currently operate under. And there wouldn't be necessarily any shortcomings in terms of check hold of large deposits that we typically operate. So from that standpoint, the last thing that was holding up us making formal recommendations to these boards was that bank seeking qualified public depository status with the state of Florida. As of when we were developing the packet, we still didn't receive that notification and certification from the state. I actually just received from the bank earlier this week on Tuesday that they actually received that from the state. So leave it there for now. There are some legislative updates. There's some bills moving forward in terms of establishing the Blue Manatee River as well as the Team River. That actually moved out of the House Committee. We personal vote on that action, but that was positive news to see that bill moving forward on the federal level. There are some private level state legislation proposed that would prevent any sort of barriers of work of municipalities on private landowner properties, private laterals, and that I believe is good news in terms of how we're trying to implement the backup campaign by homeowners to either repair, inspect, or replace their failing pipes to further reduce the contribution of those failing pipe systems to sanitary sewer. So there are a couple of state legislative topics that are pertinent to our management initiatives, and I do also want to call out that the Day Regional Planning Council has put together a legislative review committee and have a formalized document that we will do report on tracking specific bills that have an environmental potential environmental impact. So, look at that as a resource. I think the biggest thing that I would like to move towards now is sort of recognition of one of our steadfast partners in the program. Some of you may or may not know that Rob Ryan was set to retire this month. Rob has been a stalwart of the program since the inception of developing the history program, national history program. He was instrumental in participating on a technical advisory committee. He was the governance co-chair of our Tampa Bay National Consortium. He's invested a lot of his time and energy towards environmental issues, not only pertinent to Madison County, but the broader Tampa Bay region, and a valued asset in all of the discussions. He's led the way for Madison County in terms of developing regional resiliency initiatives for every county. And most importantly, I think that we reflected this past year in terms of us coming together as a community to monitor the effects of the Piney Point spill. He was instrumental in developing the regional ambient monitoring program, where all laboratories that are collecting water quality information do quarterly round robin, so that we're all on the same page in terms of certifying our laboratory results. I mean, the uniformity in terms of procedures used at the lab level. One entity reporting on quarter delay is also giving similar results in terms of their laboratory results and utilizing the money. So from that standpoint, we have a proclamation outlining all those things that he said, but we do want to recognize Rob as a champion of Tampa Bay and everything that he's accomplished for the region, both in the county and through the Tampa Bay Energy Program, where we dedicate services. And High Point last year just highlighted his passion for trying to do the right thing for the Bay. There's no words to express our appreciation for him. So, wanted to present you that, as well as the photo we got behind you as well. Thank you. And I don't want to chance the spot, but I'll give you any opportunity to express your thoughts.
Hold it up a little higher.
We get the full order.
Yeah, first I'd like to just say that we all recognize Brown for his dedicated service.
Yes. Been here since the beginning. Started in Sarasota County, and Sarasota program first, and that little experience for that. what's been established here is wonderful. Yeah, a lot of information, partnership with all of the entities. It's been great. We're trying to share this camaraderie around the state and other entities like Northeast Florida, even Dave Road. It doesn't seem to work like it does here. So we try to take grant statewide, for water resource management council. It doesn't work. So for some reason, this area is just unique, and hopefully it'll continue another. So you guys pass the torch, take it, and go. When we do one big group picture, this general area that we usually.
You know, one thing that Rob alluded to earlier is its impact has not just been on his Bay Area because of Manatee County's geographic position. He's made a major contribution to the whole central and southwest Florida coast because his contributions to all three Western and Manatee County. I think we probably have to take that back to.
Facing me. So. Everybody's fine. All right, ready? 1, 2, 3, smile. Then one more. Thank you, guys. You know, we're going to take a moment to introduce Scott Roman here. Really part of the take advantage of quite a few years. Pass it on to him.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot, Rob. Yeah, I've been involved with the issue of management source for 10 years now, so I'm honored to be able to contribute to this board in a similar way that I did with the MMC. So we're just getting here. So I do want to say thanks to Rob for your leadership in our department. Great advice. You as staff.
In the handout section. Yeah, I just wanted to make you guys aware of upcoming Yoga Days, which are long events. These likely represent all of the remaining events that have been held until next fall. I guess we're working with Possible County to try and identify for this project what we can get one Yoga Day event in the process. But it's throughout the next couple months, we've got events happening throughout the watershed. So we would love to have you there. If we share these events, come out. And then kind of jumping, no, maybe not bring a centerpiece to have on our table. On last Friday, we were invited to the Hotel's beautiful awards luncheon. It's an annual event that they put on for their volunteers and their partners. And so we were honored. We won the Outstanding Environmental Partner Award in Harvard. So it's exciting. Utah's Beautiful has been an amazing partner. They contribute on our community advisory committee. They typically win a mini grant every year for different projects that they're doing around the watershed around South County. And they help me facilitate basically every single given day that I have in South County. So really thankful for them and for the amazing partnership that we have.
Any questions?
You want to get a word in federal? I don't know.
We do that for the next conference.
Awesome.
Good with that?
You want us to do what we just did again?
Yes.
All right.
We can Photoshop out Rob's picture. Yeah. Don't remember the drill. 1, 2, 3. Yes. Thank you.
Next up is item 9 on the agenda.
You turn to page 18 in your packets. We have a summary listed on activity by staff and our executive director and sorry, what's that? Assistant executive director. Right?
Assistant director.
Assistant director, sorry. Okay, I'll get it there. I apologize. Just some brief highlights. 3 technical reports were published within our last time frame. Also, 1 peer-reviewed paper that Gary was a part of. There are 3 updates to the open science products reported by Marcus and 1 new, including the updates to the Seagrass and Transect dashboard and continuous updates to Finding Point environmental monitoring dashboard. Staff has continued to engage in multiple presentations and committee meetings in the region. At our last TAC meeting, we had presentations from SWIFMUD, from Kim Hallwards on the Little Manatee River NFL peer review process, as well as Mark Speck on the R-Sparrow loading model, climate data processing tool, and a presentation from Atkins, David Lloyd, and Shane Painter discussing the Courtney Campbell Causeway circulation monitoring results. So a lot of activity. There was discussions also on a recent algal bloom and open bay around the hump. That was
Hillsborough Bay.
Oh, excuse me, Hillsborough Bay.
And also Perico Bay.
And that was facilitated by Maya, which is fantastic. As kind of all discussed, it looks like in June, Denise is going to be raising this for presence for a very needed discussion. So I would highly recommend that if you're not able to attend our TAC meetings, highly recommend it and encourage you all to attend, or at least make sure you have some sort of representation for this relatively critical part of our ongoing conversation about expanding our geographic footprint. I will take any questions.
So we're into online, no? No questions for anybody online?
Nope.
Thank you. Next up is the community advisory.
Thank you. The community advisory committee met on January 26th, virtually, and they had presentations on the, first of all, we welcome the new member, Blake Poole. I was not there, I was on vacation, so I missed this, but I did watch it later on Zoom. That's one of the great things about virtual meetings. Later. There were presentations on the Raymond grants, Guardians of the Coast, download the workbook, and Winter Litter Prevention Project. And then discussion of 2021 grants that are upcoming. The CAC members are ready to hop any of the new grantees of the projects if they have questions. Volunteers, whatever they need. There was a presentation on CCP updates that's coming up, and CCP members were asked to review the current CCP and make comments and suggestions for the division. There was a presentation from Joe Whalen about the PyTon campaign and what's being done to promote that. And then there was a CAC roundtable talking about the upcoming basis conference and the discussion also about the boundary expansion. Which they had some really good comments. So we're ready to take part in the rest of the good days that are coming up, and we're looking forward to the time when we can meet in person and not virtually. A lot of our engagement on things. Also to be able to get out into the community more, engage in systems and let them know about the stuff that TV is doing and ways that they can. That's all I have.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? We're skipping ahead now to item 12 on the agenda. Back on track, fiscal year 2023 annual US EPA work plan, bipartisan infrastructure law.
So typically, every board meeting, we bring to you our upcoming fiscal year's draft work plan for conceptual approval. We're not doing it at this point. We're not asking for an answer at this point because of sort of uncertainty of how the new funding coming down from bipartisan infrastructure law will be integrated in our workload. Right now, what is presented in the package is a more than full draft of just the appropriations that we would receive as a national SRA program. And this is typical of what we would present at the February board meeting, but I just want to make it clear that it does not include the $915,000 that we're anticipating to use that bill funding. So in the package, there's a link to the full scope of the work plan. It's pretty well developed at this point. There's a number of projects that we will be targeting in the coming fiscal year, which will start October 1. This document actually serves as our grant application EPA to receive that funding. There is not a full federal budget for the current fiscal year. There's a continuing resolution through February 18th that are maintaining funding levels that we received last year. So this work plan is based around that level of funding, that $700,000 from the federal government matched with the local partner used from the interlocal, the updated interlocal agreement. So in total, there are probably about 490,000 we're trying to put towards projects over and above our operating budget, and they're outlined there under section 4 of the work plan on page 59, as well as section 5, which outlines both the technical projects and the community outreach and education projects that we foresee to begin on October 1 of this year. A lot of them are centered around supporting existing federal programs, monitoring that we've been doing with each of the county partners, but also implementing some of the habitat restoration initiatives outlined in the 2020 update of the writing, conversations we had with EPA where that would come to us as a separate agreement. It would be an entirely separate agreement for the plan. That's why it's not included in what we're presenting today. Through the course of developing project concepts for use of those funds, we had some conversations with partners. I know Maya has reached out to several of your staff, as well as yourselves, in terms of outlining projects that would have not only transformational benefits for some of the key issues, but also address some of the EPA requirements from that funding that is tailored towards building resiliency for underserved communities, targeting nutrient issues that are faced with coastal watersheds, bolstering job numbers and employment through these actions. So there's a number of boxes that need to be checked for that funding that we're trying to identify a good project for as we move forward over the next 5 years. We did hear, I think, I'm not going to say it's consensus of the partners, but there was a recognition that we have a lot of irons on the fire, so to speak, in terms of the variety of type of projects that we're managing now. But it did sound like there's a preference of directing those funds for one large project instead of separating that out into a bunch of small projects that we need to manage, again, towards the perspective of putting those funds towards something transformational. This is funding that's not likely to come around again. Again, depending on the funding items from EPA, we're looking at essentially supporting some of the key issues that are recognized by our partner, Don't Bay, in relation to tidal circulation impediment, whether or not this funding makes sense to use for support for causeway alteration. Not sure yet if we get that final guidance, but that's where we're leaning right now as program staff, just to bring back as a recommendation. If there's some hurdles that we need to overcome using the funds in that way, then secondarily, we've had conversations with partners on some key stormwater and or tidal creek restoration projects that could potentially serve some underserved communities in each of the partners represented in the region, essentially rotating one big project for the next 5 years amongst our partners to speak to the sort of restoration. That's where we're landing right now. Again, we're awaiting final EPA guidance on how we should be developing an agreement for that for use of these funds. But what our plan would be to come back in May based on initial discussions here, probably additional discussions we had with the big partners, sort of the timing of those projects. The other constraint for this funding is there's always a desire to have something shovel ready to go. A lot of the projects that we have had conversations with partners are not at that stage. There's some design and permitting that's probably going to be necessary before we actually get to the shovel ready stage. So again, until we have the guidance from EPA, we'll continue having these conversations. And I welcome any thoughts on the collective benefits that those resources could achieve within the region based on a collective conversation here today. At the point that we had those individual conversations with partners and we've got some concepts, but I'd also love to hear sort of what the consensus of the whole group might be moving forward from that point. So I'll stop right there. I'll take any questions you might have on the work plan or that my part of the infrastructure level. But again, we're looking for you for comments and suggestions moving forward, and then a final recommendation or vote out will come back.
And specifically, we're also interested in identifying the partner project or in-kind match.
Yes, thank you. Part of the work plan, we need to provide about 110,000 for an in-kind project fully support the anticipated federal appropriation. If there's any project that you have that our plan to be pretty much completed from October 1 of this year to September 30th of 2023, that would fit nicely in terms of the tax.
Could I be a combination of projects that add up to the 100%?
Yes.
Questions or comments for Rich?
I believe so, I mean, when I spoke to Maya about it, as we've all been talking about resources, one transformational project versus them having to manage, little buckets, it's a huge lift on their part, but we've been talking about causeway alteration for a long time now, and, there's a lot of science that supports it. I understand there's hurdles, but I know that we would be willing to be at the table with those state partners to help advocate for, for making those improvements, given everything that we've seen going on in Tampa Bay. So that's kind of where we landed, where I landed personally. Old Tampa Bay is going to continue to decline. It's going to be a challenge, and circulation is just a huge piece to how that bay segment functions. So, like Ed said, this is going to be kind of a once in a lifetime type, bill that brings millions of dollars to infrastructure, and I would hope that everyone collectively could help move that project forward.
Any other questions or comments? All right, very enough. The item 13, state of the bay, secret, conduct, and water quality.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Maya. I'm going to talk about a couple of the huge partnerships that we are involved with throughout Tampa Bay on the seagrass monitoring side, the annual transect work that is done by many of the teams here in the room, and then the annual habitat restoration report that we provide to the US EPA. Seagrass transects, this is an annual effort. It's monitoring has been conducted since about 1998. We have an annual training exercise in June to get everybody on the same page. Again, there are about nine different agencies that are involved in collecting 60-ish transects around the bay. The monitoring occurs from about late August through October. The data is now input by the database on the Water Atlas, and Marcus over the last couple of years has created a wonderful dashboard that displays all this information. This is starting to look at the dashboard of the 2021 data is in here. One of the things that you can see is that over the 30 years of the project, this graph shows presence frequency of occurrence of seagrasses throughout Tampa Bay, and you can see over that the first 15 years from 1998 to about 2015, you see that increase. And then there's, for the last couple of years, as we've seen reflected in the SWIFT bud data, somewhat of a decline in the frequency of occurrence. This set of graphs in the center of this table is color coded for percentage of frequency of occurrence. Lighter colors are lower frequency, darker colors are greater. And they're going Old Tampa Bay to Boca Ciega Bay. And then on the far left are all of the transects that are monitored on the annual projects. What's nice about this, I don't have it interactive right now, but you can choose your different species, including Caulerpa as an attached algae, so you can look at those individual species over time. You can use this slider bar that's right here to look at the specific range of years from 1998 to current. Just going to highlight a couple of the transects that we've been interested in over the last year.
First is Port Manatee, so this is right by the Piney Point outfall on the north side of Manverde Key. It's one of the sites that they have a transect conducted every other year. And so the data that you see on the top is from 2021. The next row is from 2019. And actually, when it was surveyed in the October, September timeframe, it's actually in reasonably good shape. And this sort of reflects what we saw on the ground, because this is one of the sites we were going to over the past year as part of our Piney Point monitoring. Those are very robust seagrass components. Other place is looking at Old Tampa Bay. Now this data right here is from 1998 to about 2014. I've got a second slide just going. But again, this reflects the increases that we saw over that, especially that 2010 to 2015 timeframe. There was a huge increase in seagrasses on the deep edge. These are color coded to species. The size represents Bronze Blanc K coverage, the amount of seagrass in each transect. The very bright pink fuchsia is the Clerpa. You can see a little bit of it starting to pop up here in the 2014 graph. And there was a very large expansion of this seagrass bed starting in around 2010 over the next 4 years. This is the time range from 2010 to the present. Again, you started with a fairly robust seagrass bed, but then around 2018 or so, Clerpa started to come in very significantly into the system. And over the past several years, it dominated that 2,700 meter transect. I can tell you from the 2021 data, there were 3 quadrats where they found where their seagrass was located. Everything else in there was Clerpa. But you can also see that over the past couple of years, even the Clerpa edge of transect was reduced. And from a communication with Chris Anastasio from Swiftbud, they just completed all the overflights for Tampa Bay for their biannual survey. They're saying that most of that Clerpa has disappeared. And so this feeds directly into a couple of those projects that we're proposing for the annual work plan, in that being able to utilize some of the remote sensing to understand potential inter-year variation, but also looking at on-the-ground community interactions between Clerpa and seagrasses and the habitat value of those as well. Please interrupt with any questions. The second part is on the habitat restoration projects that were conducted by all of you as our partners over the past year. And this is an EPA requirement called the Government Performance Results Act. We work with multiple partners over the course of the summer to gather the data on habitat restoration projects that were conducted during the fiscal year. For FY21, we were able to report about 70 different projects, restoration of 811 acres, 0.03 miles of restoration including shoreline enhancements. We were able to capture information. This includes things like prescribed burn or exotics controlled nearly 30,000 acres within the watershed, 13 miles of enhancement. Again, that's along shorelines where there was exotics removal or minor planting. So a total acreage that was touched with some sort of management or restoration activity of over 30,000 acres during the FY 2021, and 13 miles of that was either enhanced or restored. And all this is reflected on the water access restoration page. And this data is available for download there as well. So we're taking this data, making it a little bit more granular to help us track within the Habitat Master Plan that was produced in 2020. The hash mark bars represent the total targets for 2030. The blue solid lines are what was conducted reported in 2021. And so we can see that the forestry freshwater wetlands, this was mostly a lower green swamp project. But this we're using this data to help us track forward to see potentially where we need to maybe identify some new habitat restoration projects, or where we are with regards to meeting our goals and our targets. So for these are the estuarine uplands and non-forest freshwater wetlands. It's a different scale, so I'm putting them on a different graph. Again, we have we're continuing to track these targets, and we're thinking about trying to put this into an annual report similar to the water quality report card, using some sort of stoplight graphics for each of these habitats. One of the things that we recognize is that these habitat restoration isn't going to be continuous. There's going to be stops and starts. We'll have a couple of years where there's no oyster restoration, and then Manatee County will put in a reef that's 50 acres or something along those lines. And so we're trying to incorporate those thought processes in this. We're contracting with Jake Environmental to help us create that graphic. And we'll be looking at things like the swift flood land use, land cover, and seagrass data, some of the hard bottom artificial reef projects that are ongoing, try to identify those needs, the successes that we've seen over the time frame of these reports, and then also use this as another tool to share with all of our partners as the habitat restoration occurs. Then I've got just a couple of quick pictures on some of the projects that are highlighted through this past year. Whiskey Stump in the Hillsborough Bay, Tampa Bay Watch in Audubon. We're doing a shoreline enhancement around this little island that has been eroded over the past several years. Of course, they do some amazing volunteer work there, expecting these domes to be covered in oysters over the next couple of years. Eulalie Springs in the city of Tampa on the Hillsborough River. This was a sort of neighborhood in sort of northeast Tampa. We've been working on the monitoring project for this for the past year, and we're did exotics removal, and lots of coping grass was pulled out of there. And when there's water in the system, this is what it's like today. McGill Air Force Base, it's amazing how much land they have around in the management activities they do. They did some considerable controlled burns, some exotics removal over the last year as well. And then one of our Far East partners, the city of Lakeland, and their Sezen Wetlands project, they had some considerable freshwater wetland work over the past year. Some volunteers did a lot of planting, and it's starting to come in very nicely over the past year. So we're seeing some shifts in our seagrass species. That's why we're asking for this within the annual work plan. We had 810 acres were restored thanks to the efforts of you and your staff and the partners that we have. And we're going to be working on a user-friendly annual report to be able to wrap this up in a much neater package over the next several months. Again, just thanks to all the partners that we have. This is your baby. This is what you do all on a day in, day out basis. Much appreciated. I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Talk about how his report is time into digital living back
Good morning, everybody. Kind of following off of Gary's presentation. Beginning of each year, we like to just give an update on how we're doing in the Bay. And we have several different products that we put out every year that speak to that at different levels, from water quality to habitat to everything that we consider as an indicator of the health of the Bay. So I'm going to be talking about two of those things. One is the water quality report card, and second is this larger state of the Bay report, which is this something we try to put out every 3 years, but now we have kind of alternative media that we've been considering to present that. We'll still have the hard copy that we'll put out later this year, but we have some different digital products now we've created that I think really serve that information up in a nice way that's more timely and in line with a lot of the other interactive digital products that we've been creating. So I believe somebody printed up copies of this. I see on the table, so I do have to do that. So this is our annual report card for water quality. I think everybody is pretty familiar about what this is, what it provides. We put this out every year to show you how we're doing as a program within the 4 major Bay segments that we monitor and report on in the Bay. There's 2 sides to this. The first side is on the left there. That's sort of our programmatic assessment that we look towards as what we should be considering as different management options for making sure water quality is above board. And then the right side is more of the regulatory side that, like, folks at the NMC might be more concerned about in terms of whether or not we're meeting our chlorophyll criteria for the reasonable assurance plan and report to DEP. So they kind of report on similar things, but kind of different objectives as to the 2 different sides there. So definitely have a look at that, and you can view it online as well. And also just to remind everybody, we also have this wonderful dashboard that presents more or less the same information, but definitely in a different medium online that really is an attempt to give you that deeper dive into the breadth of information that is included in the report card. So everything is there digitally. The graphics are all interactive, and this has been updated as well with the 2021 water quality results. So what happened this year? Obviously, there were some pretty major events that we were concerned about. With State Pine Point was the big one. But as a whole, if you look at the 4 major Bay segments, the story this year is pretty much the story we had the year prior, the year prior to that. So Old Tampa Bay continues to be kind of the problem child here. That's obviously a concern. Just because it's the same score this year as it was last year doesn't mean we need to sort of consider business as usual. This is still a concern for the program and all of our partners in terms of what we are trying to do to make sure that that Bay segment is above board in terms of meeting its criteria. So you'll see that chlorophyll concentrations for Old Tampa Bay were above the target. Light penetration, so water clarity in that Bay segment, is still within the target, so it's not quite exceeding that level, but it is nonetheless, if you look at the trend of light attenuation in that Bay segment, it is trending in a direction that is not necessarily favorable. But in terms of the other Bay segments, we had greens, so stay the course, if you will. It's sort of the mantra we use with that assignment. Now, you might be wondering, did Pine Point have an effect on these scores? I will get to that. I think there are some important considerations about what that meant for our water quality, how we monitor it, and how we report it here, but we'll get to that in a second. These are just sort of snapshots of some things that you'll see on the 2-pager there, but also on our online dashboard, and kind of breaking it down, what it looks like, for the 40 some odd years of monitoring data we have by the different Bay segments. So you see, this is our stoplight graphic report card, Old Tampa Bay column right here. Just to highlight the last 7 years, it's been in this yellow category. So things have not improved. Obviously, we do care about that. We're trying to do things to make that better and rectify that situation. And then these other 2 ones are the 2 components that go into that red, yellow, green stoplight. So we look at chlorophyll as one piece of that. We look at light attenuation as the other piece of that. And of course, this is all geared towards seagrasses as an endpoint of our metric of success, basically. And so for 3 of the last years, Old Tampa Bay has not met its chlorophyll criteria. And this is something the NPC cares about a lot, because this goes back to conversations about load allocations and folks being on the line for what they need to do under the regional assurance plan. So this is our concern, not new information, but one that continues to be something we care about, obviously, in terms of what we're doing as a program. There's other pieces of the report card that are worth noting. This is just looking at a seasonal progression of chlorophyll in Old Tampa Bay. I think we all kind of understand why Old Tampa Bay continues to be an issue, and it is linked to our good friend pyridinium right here. Midsummer, early fall, this is when we see large chlorophyll concentrations in that bay segment. So this is July, August in red here, 2021. This is driven by pyridinium blooms. And spatially, this is kind of what it looks like. So generally, we see the highest chlorophyll concentration in the northwest part of that bay segment. And that, again, is driven by pyridinium blooms. So there's a seasonal component and there's a spatial component. That's really the main take-home message there. And again, going back to what we really try to manage for as sort of bread and butter of our program, seagrasses. Not to really beat the dead horse here, but we know that we've seen losses, and this is continuing to be an issue. And especially in Old Tampa Bay, a lot of the losses we saw in the mapped coverage in 2018 and 2020 was in that part of the bay, and we think that is linked to obviously the water quality issues that we're seeing there. So this is really tying all back to how we manage nutrients in the bay and what our endpoint is. All right, so Piney Point, when this really went down this year, we really had concerns for what that meant in terms of water quality as a whole in the bay from our reporting perspective, what we're kind of interested in as a program for monitoring and managing. And so if you look at the report card, you'll see that 2021 doesn't look a whole lot different from 2020, 2019, 2018. So the question is, well, did Piney Point really affect what we're seeing in our report card? And the answer, I think, there is no. But it's a complicated question because there's issues around sampling and temporal effects and other things that aren't in the report card that are obviously were impacted by Piney Point. So in terms of this report card, we didn't see a signal, but it doesn't mean Piney Point wasn't obviously a huge issue for the bay. We wrote a paper about it. It's in review right now that really documents all those impacts. But again, I just want to bring this up as to why you're not necessarily seeing that signal in the report card. And one of the reasons is that it was an acute event. So it's fairly short-lived. And the other reason I think is the report card really just looks at chlorophyll and light attenuation, which were impacted, but there were sort of spatially specific impacts that we were observed. And that didn't really show up on a large scale in the way we look at it in the report card. So I wanted to show you sort of an example of how that kind of played out and why we didn't necessarily see those effects manifested in the report card. And so I have 2 examples here. This is a time series of a monitoring station that DEP was looking at, and that's right here, right near the discharge site of Fort Manatee. And this is Station 91 that's part of the EPC long-term monitoring right here, a little further away from the discharge site. And first thing to notice is the difference in scale. So we see, upwards of 60 micrograms per liter, in July. This was, of course, linked to the red tide, I think. And then looking at the scale for the EPC station, doesn't really go above 8 micrograms per liter. And that's, I think, because, one, it's farther away from the discharge site. So this was and depending on what time of year you look at, spatially restricted event. But also the timing of the sampling was also really critical for this. So EPC, it's fixed monitoring on a monthly scale, not necessarily similar to the response-based monitoring that we were doing for Piney Point that was going on a much more frequent basis. So not to point fingers or really, suggest that the monitoring was insufficient, but if you look at the sample points for June and July right here. And this is, again, farther away from the discharge site, but just coincidentally, this missed the peak and the red tide in the bay. And I think that possibly, is one reason why we didn't see a large effect, at least in the water quality. So this, does have implications, obviously, in terms of how we think about sampling for routine monitoring beyond just Piney Point. So when we talk about pyridinium blooms in Old Tampa Bay, if we want to get maybe a better handle on that, we need to think about maybe supplementary sampling or other ways we could get a more finite temporal signal of what's actually happening in that part of the bay beyond the extensive monitoring program that UPC does. So yeah. Any questions about that before I go on to state of the bay?
Yeah, Marcus, I was curious as to why you said a station on the market, 3 or 4 other stations, regular monitoring stations. Most of them, of course, and we consider better to have a station and a pressing.
Yeah, there's a couple, and I just picked this one for an example. The other ones didn't show up like much the other FTP stations did. So it's tricky. I mean, with the Piney Point monitoring event, there were so many partners going out at just varying levels of effort. And I mean, my intent is not to nitpick the sampling you guys do. It's obviously a great resource for what we do as a program, but it wasn't at the level of sampling, say, as FMP. And that's fine. It's just these events are so temporally specific in some cases, depending on where you're looking, and spatially variable. And even though we had so much data to look at this, it was really a challenge to combine it all or really say what was the signal. And that was really kind of the point of our paper. But obviously, for something like our report card, we want to use something that is a known fixed sampling routine, because that's basically there's a precedent for that. But what I'm also trying to maybe suggest is that some of these other more spatially specific, whether it be Piney Point or pyridinium, there's other sampling methods that could support that in a different way depending on the objective.
Again, you guys were all close. They would change and we relied on long-term on hone our management and understanding and say proper these sort of events and anomalies that we're dealing with now. We might call for different monitoring that we understand that's all trying to get out. Not just get away from any one thing what's going on.
Right.
Just we have different issues now that might require different or supplementary. That's the further
No, and the only reason I asked was because you had already addressed the spatially the one that any different closer to the report, our section of the report is close to the one that's inside. So what we're seeing is not an artifact of spatial authority more than it is done.
Yeah, it's a little both, but I think it's more of a temporal issue, honestly. Having stared at so many of these data points over the last couple of months. So yeah. All right, so that's our report card for 2021. Have a look at it. Stay the course on some segments, but caution in others is what we're saying. So state of the bay, as I said, beginning, this is something that we produce. Actually, every MP produces a state of the bay report every 3 years. We have had an online presence for it in the past with the website update 2 years ago. We had a new web page for it. And actually, what we did was this is sort of the clickable interface that was on the website. And what we did was had placeholder static PDF documents that spoke to each one of these core strategies that we think about as a program. And obviously with open science and all the things I kind of evangelize about, I thought we could do this better. And now that we are geared towards the 2022 print copy State of the Bay. This was a chance to update the website. And so I just want to point this out, one, because it's new, and two, I would love everyone's feedback on how it looks. So this is the page. The interface is still the same, but instead of these static PDFs we put up here, we've actually got what we're calling, I guess, living documents that, if you've heard me talk about open science products before, these are documents that tap into the data source and are compiled in almost real time and are reflecting data up to date, essentially. And it's all interactive. It's like the dashboards we've had, but now it's like a dashboard that kind of lives on our web page, which to me is a great move forward towards how we present this information. So this is our report card. This is the water quality page. It's tab information. It looks very similar to what you're looking at in the report card there. We've got it set up for all of the different pieces that go in there. We have one about nitrogen loading right there. So what's been going on, stats and trends there. So yeah, have a look at it. Let us know if you think this is an improvement. I would be surprised to hear if it wasn't an improvement, but
We're excited.
yes. Yeah, so a lot of the social media stuff, the comms team is, I actually work with them very closely to try to get a hold of their data sets. Joe and Sheila and others have been curating a lot of that, but I've never seen it. So I actually got my hands on it and actually, putting it out in these graphics about what has happened with Instagram likes over, since Joe isn't tracking, for example. So have a look at that. Let us know. This is still kind of draft. It's obviously live on our webpage, but there's room for opportunity in improving this based on the feedback. And
we're especially interested in, this is like our attempt at the shallow snorkel. We started with the deep dive, for resource managers and experts, but so any comments or suggestions you have about if you think this information is portrayed in a way that's accessible to a lay audience, or even to you, if there's something that you think will not hurt our feelings, that is exactly the feedback we want to hear. So please tell us if there's something you don't understand or you think the public won't understand. Go, Chris.
The poop emoji. Just curious as to why you chose that versus some other type of dog.
The emoji library doesn't have one of a dog going. So,
but that's where you're.
And our most recent campaign is not necessarily about scoop the poop from your dogs, but it is about pipe up from the waste from your home out to the.
Fair enough. Thank you.
But that sort of feedback is cool too, because emojis are one way to just show information, and if that's something that you think you can change, let us know. It's a very simple thing like that. And to really drive the point home about how this is a step forward, I think, for our reporting. The graphics are there, they're tied into the data, but it's not just the graphics, it's the text. So our print copy of State of the Bay will come out every 3 years, but our goal is to have this online version updated every year, just on an annual rolling basis with the most up-to-date information. So when you see text like this that says, oh, results for 2021, this isn't me typing up the text on the web page. This is like an HTML document that pulls in the data with code from the source. And so when it's compiled, it looks like regular text that somebody just typed up from their head, but this is text that's driven by data. So to me, that's a very cool advancement in how we're reporting this information. It's timely and relevant. So that's my soapbox. So yeah, just to summarize, our water quality report card, obviously, whole Tampa Bay is our problem child. Let's continue to stay vigilant on that. It's probably been said before, we do have an actual science grant from NOAA that's seeking to identify and implement management strategies for this. And it's not just thinking about nutrients. We've obviously done a great job keeping nutrient loads under control there, but there's other strategies we can think about, like moisture restoration or hydrologic modifications that have been on the forefront of conversations recently. And then the piney point thing I talked about, temporal, spatial issues around that, and disconnects between what our report card is showing and the more holistic assessment of water quality. And then State of the Bay, give us your feedback. that's all I'll say on that. So, thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Any questions, comments? All right, hearing none, go.
I just wanted to thank my staff for taking the work on this. Keep undertaking the program all this and to make it a living document that isn't stale, so that are providing work updates, even relevant and pertinent information that's relying on a lot of your guys' work. So hopefully reflecting back a lot of the great work that our partners are doing in understanding the big data. So that's our goal in developing this living document. Again, we're asking for comments and input in terms of improvement. I'm challenging my staff to think about other metrics, including the sort of first set that align with our prior database. There are other things that we can start pulling. More to come in the future, but again, once we met all of our staff.
So if we were to go back to our respective offices, turn everybody loose on this webpage, what do we focus on?
I think Marcus is going to be out on leave, so I think if you send it to me, I'll make sure that it spans both teams.
Yeah, also, if you do want any of these graphics, to download them. So feel free to use them, put them in your own reports. That's kind of what they're doing. Thank you, everyone.
All right, last item is the quarterly progress report.
Yeah, in your packet, an update on our progress on the different projects that we're managing in the program. There's a line there. It just gives you a little bit of the stats on where we're at in terms of total expenditures and key tasks for the projects outlined in our work plan and program. Staying busy, still have a lot of open projects to close out, but this is really, I think, elevated program and our reach within the watershed, not just looking at our EPA work plan funding, but also these other funding that and this is at your disposal. There's active links to drill down, look at any projects, get questions on, or if you have questions in general about what we're working on, what's related to that work we put. Other than that, there are the next meeting dates that we are back in. So get the maybe. May 20th is the next management board. The 27th will be the following.
I do remiss if I didn't take my last flight that our colleague. I think on behalf of everybody, the entire staff, you've been a reliable call book down there, and we keep on track for everything done, and we keep on track a long after the time.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Was amazed at the progress that's made over the last 30 years. We started this thing. We have a problem with the things we get better. Personally, I never thought we would be figuring out before. When we started, we had no idea what we were doing. So, keep up with it.
Thank you, Ray. With that, we are.